Welcome to the Influence Experiment, where we seek to explore the art and the science of building influential capacity. Every month, we want to raise thought-provoking ideas of how you can be an investor of the influence you carry. If you're ready to journey with us, then it's time to experiment.
Welcome back, my fellow learners and leaders. This is Tony Villafane coming at you with another episode of the Influence Experiment. Well, today we are talking about how to prevent burnout. We live in a fast-paced, overstimulated, accomplishment-driven world. Everything is about pursuing dreams, the highest pay scale, the greatest title, the best accolades, the most social media clouds, and for Christians, the most impact for the kingdom of God at times. We feel like we're invincible and we keep moving forward at the speed of lightning only to be rudely reminded by one thing. We are finite. Despite what we think, we do indeed have limited energy and capacity, but we live as if we don't. Burnout can be a scary thing to be, as it can ruin your job, your career, family, marriage, friendships, and even your own life. The scariest part is many of us are on the road to burnout and we don't even realize it. So how in the world do we avoid and prevent burnout? This is a hefty and tall question to answer, and that is why we've invited Counselor Dave Wheatus to provide all the secrets and all the answers to this very specific topic. Dave, thank you for coming and bringing all the answers for us today.
Well, I appreciate being here with you, Tony. I don't think that I have to give a disclaimer as an attorney that we're not going to have all the answers and all the secrets, but we'll do the best we can.
Well, Burrow, thank you so much for being able to join us. Can you just tell me a little bit about who you are and what you're about?
Sure. I'll start with my career. I'm the founder and executive director of a ministry called Serving Leaders Ministries, and that's a ministry I founded 16 years ago. It's hard to believe that it's been that long, but 16 years ago, where we come alongside and provide pastoral care to ministry leaders. And we do that in a number of ways. We provide family counseling, marriage counseling. We provide coaching. We do a lot of training for ministry leaders to how do they shepherd their hearts so that they can prevent burnout or heal from burnout, as well as deal with other issues in their lives. And in fact, I do a lot of mediation work where when people are in conflict, churches are in conflict, families, businesses sometimes. I do a lot of mediation work where we help people reconcile, come together. Yeah, right on. Wow. No, and what is such a needed ministry, unfortunately, but what's such a needed ministry to be able to have. So that is a bit of what you do. A little bit about who you are. Who am I? I am, it's a great question. I am a Jewish kid who became a Christian in my teen years. I met Jesus through a very powerful experience with him, even though I'd never heard the gospel before. Wow. Essentially, I asked God, who are you? If you show me who you are, I'll give you my life. And he, in a beautiful way, revealed himself to me, and I gave my life to him. Wow. The journey has entailed a lot of different things. One of my first jobs was playing drums for a Christian rock band. I moved down to Texas and played with them for a while. I painted houses for a while. I became a high school teacher. Okay. Went to law school. I'm a very unstable... Wow, that was an eclectic background here. Yeah, very unstable. I can't keep a job right now. I went to law school. I've been an attorney now for over 30 years. Wow. But I also, during my practice, I got my master's in counseling because I was very interested in helping people. And in helping people, I thought I need to get some training. So I went and got my master's in counseling at Cairn University, where I now am an adjunct professor teaching legal and ethical issues in counseling. Not as boring as it sounds. And I'm also married to an amazing woman who is artistic. She exudes creativity in everything she does. So she paints, she draws, she acts, she sings. She's a movie maker. She just made a short film which has gotten 6 awards. Wow. And it's out there. It's called To the Wood. Okay. And if you Google Miho, M-I-H-O, Khan, K-A-H-N, Miho, To the Wood, it'll come up on YouTube. It's a wonderful 10-minute short film. Wow. In addition to that, she has a one-woman show that's called Clean Sheets. I'm sure some of our audience has heard of that. And we've had the privilege of doing Clean Sheets, which is her faith journey, a story of her faith journey. We've done it in India, China, Lebanon, Beirut, Lebanon, Haiti, and all around the Northeast. So
Wow.
it's a privilege. I get to play piano for her in that. And in addition, I have 2 kids, 2 great kids. Go figure, one's an attorney, my son, and the other, my daughter, is an artist just like her mom. So, go figure how that
Incredible.
happens.
Wow. Dave, what again, like I used the word eclectic earlier, what a background that is, and just so neat to see. I mean, I'll bet we'll even hear some of this from your own journey and story of how all those different titles or jobs or capacities has led you to this moment within the Ministry of Serving Leaders and the topic around burnout, which is why I invited you to be a part of this as something that you are able to speak towards. And so, as we comically dive in maybe for a moment, what would you say is just an embarrassing story that comes to mind that you did when you were just so exhausted, you weren't thinking clearly, or something of that nature due to tiredness? What comes to mind?
Okay, well, Miho and I had returned from China. I was teaching there, and she has done clean sheets in China. We came back, and everybody is familiar with jet lag. It's a 12-hour time difference.
Yep.
So my normal routine was, when I try to work out, I'd go to LA Fitness typically, and I usually work out, and I go swimming. So in this case, the day after I got back from China, and I don't do jet lag real well. I worked out, and I then went to the locker room to get ready to go swimming. And as I walked down the pool, if everybody can envision the Olympic-sized swimming pool, I'm walking down there. There's windows on each side, right, to the public. I look down, and in my right hand is my towel, and in my left hand is my bathing suit.
Okay.
Oh. Exactly.
No.
Yes. I look down, I'm shocked. I look around, I immediately put my bathing suit on, and I think, oh my gosh, it's on camera, I'm going to get arrested or something.
My goodness.
So I looked around, I don't think anybody saw me, but that's how exhausted I was.
Shoot.
I was just so out of it that I wasn't thinking clearly. And so you ask about exhaustion, that's the kind of thing that can happen.
Like public nudity.
Public nudity.
Yep, wow. Okay.
Embarrassment. Or worse, actually.
Worse for sure.
Yeah.
Okay.
You didn't see that coming.
No, I wasn't. That was a vulnerable response. I appreciated that, but embarrassing indeed fits the bill.
Yeah.
Okay. Dave, this is gonna be so good. I'm so looking forward to diving into this with you, man. Start us off 30,000 feet.
Yeah.
How would you define burnout?
Burnout, okay. First of all, the term burnout is a component of a broader category called compassion fatigue, and that's more the typical correct name for the idea of burnout. So compassion fatigue, I'll define it as a state of spiritual, emotional, and physical exhaustion from long-term helping or caring for people. Now, it's a convergence of 3 different things. One is primary traumatic stress, another is secondary stress, and a third is what we call burnout. So let me unpack each of those. So primary traumatic stress is when you actually are exposed to extreme events directly. You're in a car accident. A pastor is at the hospital side, hospital bed when someone's dying. That's direct trauma, emotional trauma, or even physical trauma. So a lot of people underestimate, and particularly people in ministry, underestimate how much primary stress they're exposed to. All right. The second component is secondary traumatic stress, which is simply exposure to extreme events through the eyes of another person.
Okay.
So I'm sitting and I'm counseling, and I hear a story of someone, let's say it's sexual abuse or something that happened to somebody. I'm not there when it happened. Maybe it happened 50 years ago. But I'm hearing the story, and it's as if I'm living in it. Because my mind is going and imagining. A quick example, my nephew committed first-degree murder 40 years ago. And he confided in me what he did. Now, I wasn't there. But I imagined, and he explained exactly what he did, which I won't repeat, but he explained it to me. And so that image in my own mind is in me. And it floats, it's there. So when I'm in a certain circumstance, like walking up steps in my own home, I remember what he told me, how he did this.
Yeah, I imagine.
And so that's secondary stress. So a lot of people underestimate how much secondary stress they have. So you don't have to be a pastor to have that.
Sure.
A friend, you listen to a friend who's telling you about a breakup or some problem that they have. You're actually receiving that's secondary traumatic stress.
Yep.
So you got primary traumatic stress when you directly experience trauma, secondary stress when you hear or see the story, and then third is burnout, which is a state of physical, mental, and emotional exhaustion. So think about the idea of exhaustion.
Yep.
In all kinds of ways. And you experience attrition of motivation and vitality and a depletion of energy. And it's linked to many negative physical and mental health outcomes. So it can't be underestimated. Depression and coronary artery disease and hypertension and sleep disturbances all can result from this idea of compassion fatigue. And it's important to understand that it's pretty common.
Yeah.
Many people experience it to some degree or another. And so it's something that we need to pay attention to.
Yeah. Well, I think that I appreciate that because you parsed out what simply is burnout. You parsed it into 3 different categories, and I think that those are really important to think about because it's not just a physical car accident is that primary traumatic response to you mentioned I'm hearing about someone who committed a murder to the breakup to like those secondary spaces all the way to the third of depression and of those things, and so to be able to say that it's not just we can't just say burnout. We have to define our terms,
right?
And which is exactly what we're trying to do here. So thank you for helping lay a little bit of a foundation.
And I'll just note that when I do this seminar, I do a whole 6-hour seminar on avoiding burnout or what is burnout. We do some exercises, and what I'll do is after I define each of those terms, I'll say, so give yourself a score. 1 to 10, 10 being you've been exposed to a lot of primary stress.
Yeah.
Or give yourself a score on how exhausted you are.
Yep.
And then when we give people time to think, slow down and think about it, and then it really hits people.
I imagine.
And when you start to think about your own experiences, this can go back all your life. I mean, my mother, for example, collapsed in my arms with a brain hemorrhage. I had to lay her down, gave her mouth-to-mouth resuscitation for a few minutes before an ambulance came. That's primary traumatic stress. It just doesn't evaporate. You don't just bury that. If you try to bury it, it comes up other ways.
Oh, I believe it in my own life and watching in lives of other people as well. So, what would you say then are some of the warning signs that come that you might see if someone is on their way to burnout? On the way to burnout,
I would say a number of things. Number one, some physical symptoms like headaches, muscle aches, high blood pressure. But people are more tuned into how exhausted they are. Cynicism, becoming cynical about something that you loved. As a youth pastor, I'm sure you love what you do. If you find yourself becoming really cynical about that would be a sign. When you start to overlook your own personal needs, when you feel overworked, underappreciated, undervalued, right?
Yep.
And no longer in control. A big tip-off to and a big danger thing about being burned out or having compassion fatigue is boundary violations. People will start to engage in behavior that they would not otherwise engage in. So there's a loss of a moral compass, which is a huge kind of warning sign that someone's getting burned out.
Yeah.
And also disillusionment and loss of perspective of your job, of your career, of your family. Things don't really mean as much as they did before. Those are all kinds of warning signs of burnout.
Well, and what's so wild is that you list off these things, and these aren't small things relatively, and yet so many people are on their way to burnouts, and they don't even recognize these things.
It's true.
This level of self-deception or lack of self-awareness is, and trust me, I'm so guilty of that, unfortunately, in seasons of my life, but how easily we can not even, it's not even that we ignore them, it's that we just are not observant enough to our own self and our own finiteness as we go.
Well, I think it's really important to understand that, exhaustion is one thing. Burnout is a gradual process. That's why we don't get it, right? It's a gradual, think about this, it's a gradual loss, a process of loss of hope. It's a loss of focus on what you do.
Yep.
It's a loss of joy that normally you might have. It can be a loss of relationships, loss of pride and satisfaction in your work, So that work becomes a source of frustration, whereas before it might have been something you loved.
Oh, yeah.
So the key point, though, is we acclimate to new normals. And, you know, you yourself said in the introduction, you know, we are fast-paced and busy. We don't stop. And so as we acclimate to being busier and busier and have no margins, you don't see it coming.
Yep.
I personally have experienced, look, I teach this stuff, I do seminars, and I have personally experienced burnout on a number of occasions.
Sure. And that's so real to say. And let's be honest, none of us like admitting our own weakness and our own. Again, I've used the word a couple times now, but finiteness. We're not infinite. We, as much as we like to think that we are, and I think it's profound for you to be able to say that isn't like it's a slow fade. It's a gradual process was the word that you used, and no one like, you know, wakes up and says that like, oh, I'm going to go be a drug dealer. Like, it's a gradual process of I've tried drugs, and then I've taken them, and then I participate recreationally, and then it turns into a habit, addiction, the whole 9 yards in that sense. Yeah. So it's a gradual process of burnout. And I think I can appreciate you saying there is a difference between exhaustion and burnout. Exhaustion is normal, good, even to say you've spent yourself with excellence. I'm exhausted at the end of a day. But this burnout that you've been able to identify some of these warning signs is really key in this movement of how am I being self-aware.
And for me personally, I'll relate a couple of years ago. I went on a vacation in July, I think it was, for 2 weeks. And I came back to the office thinking I'm going to be restored and better. You know, I just went on 2-week vacation. I literally walked into my office. No one was in the entire office. And I laid down on the floor and I said, God, I can't do this. I can't do this. So I obviously had not been attending to my own soul in a way that was appropriate.
Sure.
And healthy and godly. It's just stretching myself too thin. Yep. It's happened on a number of occasions to me. So it does creep up on you, and there's no shame in it. We just need to know when it's happening and have friends enough around us who love us enough who will say, you need to slow down.
Oh, yep.
And not just you know, give that lip service.
Yeah, no, that's so true. To have people around you to be able to slow down, I think that is so crucial, so needed, and to be able to, as you said, to be able to listen to others. There's someone who comes to mind for me that I really enjoy listening to, Rebecca Lyons and Gabe Lyons. They produced a number of books, and they are phenomenal Christian leaders. And Rebecca says this quote in a seminar session I got to listen to her. She says this: we can awaken into our calling and still not be free. And if we are not careful, this calling will turn into just a pretty version of striving. Without freedom, we will copy and compete and compare, and we will eventually burn out. And every time I come back to this quote, it hits me in a different way, in a convicting way. If I'm being honest, as I wrestle with my own sin and my own pride. But would you be able to interact with this quote a little bit of what Rebecca is trying to say here? Sure.
I think that's a very powerful quote. I love it. And the more I can see why every time you interact with it, it gets deeper. When I think about that, you know, many people get their identity from their calling. And that everything that the calling entails. So, you know, if I'm called to be a pastor, everything that I'm doing, I start to get my identity from that. In other words, God can call you into a ministry or a career, and you get your identity from what you do, rather than who you are in Christ.
Yeah.
And if we get our identity from what we're doing, performance is everything. I have to perform really well. And so that's what, you know, when she talks about the calling can turn into a version of striving. Why am I striving? Because I am trying to perform well to prove who I am, as opposed to getting my identity from my relationship with Christ. And it's easy then, if I'm doing performance, then the key is how am I doing compared to other people? So she talks about this idea of comparing and competing. How many people do you compete with in life? So the whole thing here is, if I'm competing and comparing and not living up, I'm never good enough. That's going to create stress. It's going to create anxiety. And that all contributes to getting burned out.
Absolutely. And another quote that comes to mind, actually, that complements Rebecca's really, really well, is one from Paul David Tripp, who says that we find our identity in one of two places. We're going to find it vertically in who we are in Christ, or we're going to shop for it horizontally in the circumstances or relationships of our daily life. And I get so, just like this quote from Rebecca, I get so challenged by it because I'm like, okay, I'm going to find it in one of two places. I'm either going to be so content in the vertical with who I am with Jesus, or I'm just going to shop for it because I'm in discontentment and copying and competing and comparing. And it is a real reality that it is a hard discipline to. Oh man, sometimes it feels like it's impossible.
Well,
at times.
It's exhausting.
Sure.
Right? To shop for it in other people. So what that means is I need you to affirm me. And I'll do anything to get you to affirm me and compliment me and make me feel good about myself.
Yep.
So how dependent do I get on that? And how empty is it? Because you know what? It's never enough.
Yep.
So that's why going to getting our identity from Christ is all.
Well, it makes me think of I think it's in Jeremiah, the book of Jeremiah, that says like the broken cisterns that cannot hold water. It's like we're trying to get water from a well that's just broken on the side and it's not even giving us anything, and we keep dumping water into it and it keeps on pouring out. It's not gonna fulfill us, and yet we are driven by needing the respect and love and dependency of other people, and at its core, some of those things are not bad. It's when they become our idol.
That's right.
Our identity, our sole focus, that can lean us toward burnout. Okay, Dave, $1 million question. How in the world does someone avoid burnout? Okay. How would you speak to that?
I would say this. The good news is that it's not complicated. It's not like you have to know how to do brain surgery. Anybody can avoid burnout.
All right. Do tell.
So I'm going to give you 7 things to think about in avoiding burnout and even healing from burnout. And the big category is you have to practice healthy, what I call biblical self-care.
Okay.
So ready for the first one?
Please.
Slow down. How complicated is that? Slow down. Many of us are really busy and we have no margin. So we have to develop and practice healthy rhythms in life. And engaging in self-care is not selfish. It's really, really important. Secondly, and this is connected to this idea of self-care, is that you have to see ministry as well as life and your career, whatever you do, as a gift. So therefore it's a stewardship issue. God has given you a gift. He's given me a gift in ministry, for example. I have to care for that. If somebody gave you a valuable painting or piece of furniture, there's things that you would do to care for that.
Yep.
And if you didn't care for it, you'd be an unwise steward.
Sure.
God calls us to be wise stewards of the gifts that He's given to us. And so think about this. He's given us our minds. He's given us our bodies. He's given us our souls. And so ministry is a stewardship issue. How are you taking care of yourself so that you're effective in ministry, that you're doing everything that God calls you to do and are able to do it? It's no glory to be able to say, oh, I'm burned out, or I'm so busy. I think a lot of people do get, identity in how busy they are.
Well, it's almost like a badge of honor.
Yeah.
Which is sick to think about, but like, oh, I'm so busy, and as a badge of honor. So, yeah. Right.
So I often tell people that we minister to is, you've got to say no in order to say yes to the right things. Saying no is difficult. Yep. It's really hard. It's hard for me. I get opportunities to do certain things, and I start to say yes before I even thought about the implications. So it takes an intentional decision to say, okay, I'm going to engage in wise self-care. I'm going to see myself as finite, as limited, embracing my limits. That's a key thing. Yeah. That's a third one we could add there. I need to embrace my limits. I realized a number of years ago that I was invited to speak up in Boston and in Pittsburgh within the same 3 days. And whereas previously I would have driven to Boston and then driven on over to Pittsburgh, right? And I realized a few years ago, I said, you know what? I can't do that anymore. So I have to embrace my limits as a gift from God, as opposed to just a limit that prevents me from doing what I want to do. All right, another one. Cultivate an intimate relationship with Christ. And this means implicitly slowing down to be with Him. slowing down sufficiently to be with Christ to sustain our doing for Christ.
Yeah.
I didn't make that up. That's a Pete Scazzaro
Emotionality,
statement.
spirituality.
Yeah. So the idea here is engaging in periods of silence, solitude. We all have quiet times, or we read our Bible feverishly to get something. How about being with Jesus just to be with him, to hear him, to listen to him? Fourth, pay attention to some real basics. And again, remember I said this isn't brain surgery. This is not profound, but if you practice it, it is profound. How about this? Sleeping, eating, and exercise. How many of us don't get sufficient sleep, or eat poorly, or don't get the exercise our bodies need? Again, this is my body that God's given me. I need to be a steward of what he's given me. So we can talk more about that, but the idea here is, as a counselor, most of the time if somebody comes in depressed, I'm always checking, how are you sleeping? Are you eating well? We ignore the basics. Fourth, I've lost count, whatever number I'm on here. Learn how to process emotions in a healthy way. Most of us don't engage our emotional being. Most of us sort of suppress it. We mask over pain. We medicate pain. You can't bury emotions. They get buried alive, and if they get buried alive, they resurrect, and they affect other parts of our bodies or our other relationships. So that's a really important thing to do, is how do you process emotion? How do you stay in the pain that you're feeling, the loneliness or whatever it is, and deal with it in a godly way? Next is observe the Sabbath. Now, you would think that in my saying this, people would go, oh, that sounds pretty legalistic. But it is a commandment. It wasn't a suggestion. And so when I'm counseling pastors and people, I'm talking about, do you have a Sabbath? Do you take 24 hours where you rest from what you normally do those 6 days, and you are quiet before the Lord, you contemplate him, you get refreshed in him, and do things that refresh you. When I was practicing law, I was going on trial. And it's not like on TV, you sort of think about your opening argument the night before. You work months in advance. I was working months in advance to get ready for a long trial. And so every day was a 15 to 16 hour day. And when my wife introduced this idea, and a friend introduced the idea of Sabbath to me, I thought, no, never. You don't understand. I can't afford that. And the key is, I can afford it. I can't afford not to. And so it's a really, really powerful thing. And then finally, look at relationships. Are you connected with healthy relationships? Do you have good relationships where you can talk about your issues in a real way? You can be vulnerable and honest and real. So I know it's a long answer, but I think these are really good bullet points to think about and contemplate and really develop.
We could hit pause right here and let people just marinate and think about those things alone, because they're so profound. You said it's not brain surgery, and yet there is there's simplicity to it, but there is a deep difficulty to be able to achieve these things because of all the badges of honor of busyness and our inability to say no, and our even sometimes our scaredness of intimacy with relationships or to Jesus, to paying attention to the basics of my own health, guilty of physical at times, and emotions. No one likes dealing with their own emotions at times, and you've used a phrase which was something to the effect of viewing our finiteness or our dependency as a gift from God. And I'm like, that's beautiful. That's difficult, but it's beautiful.
Well, let's just think about this. God didn't make me to be in two places at one time. And he didn't make me in a way that I could drive my car and write an article at the same time. Although we try sometimes, right? But the point is, there have been times when I have gotten laid awake in bed with anxiety, for example, at 3 a.m, thinking about all of the things that I have to do. And anxiety is really created when we imagine what we have to do And we put ourselves in that place. So the way I define it is I'm importing my imagination of a future event into the present, and then my body and my soul responds as if it's happening right now.
Wow, okay.
So I'm at 3 a.m, I'm thinking about the meeting I have to be at, the article I have to write, the speech I have to give, and what ifs. What if I don't know what I'm talking about? What if I'm not prepared? What if I don't get there on time, etc., right?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So we can manufacture millions of scenarios that will create anxiety. So here's what I discovered. God, I'm in my bed. There's nowhere else I can be at 3 a.m. right now. All you've given to me to do is to sleep and not to imagine all these other things. So I can stay in the present, in God's presence, and stop thinking about everything and be with Him and allow Him to minister to me. Now, I know it sounds easy. It's not as easy.
At all.
But we have to train ourselves to do these kind of things. So
it's a discipline.
It's a discipline, and you don't just, like any other thing, you don't just get it. You have to practice it.
You have to be willing to work at it, and the intentionality of it for sure. I think about, when I think about some intentionality that's needed in this particular conversation, I think about some things that there's arts, and then there's science, there's objectivity, and there's subjectivity, and it can get convoluted in this conversation of, well, again, what is objective, what is subjective, and how to pursue this thing well. So can you speak to that for a moment, about what some of the science, some of the objective truth behind burnout and prevention of burnout, and some of the, weirdly to say, but some of the art behind the prevention of burnout? How would you speak to that?
Well, I would say let's talk about subjective first. Everybody is an individual, and you have your own predilections, you have your own weaknesses, you have your own needs, right? And so you have to pay attention to your subjective feelings about what's happening for you. So, I know that I need to be with people, for example. I don't want to spend weeks alone by myself. That's a subjective thing. My wife, on the other hand, she could be alone for a week and glory in silence. So subjectively, I need to know that about myself, or I need to know how much rest I need. I need to know what I need to eat, as opposed to, you get to eat maybe lots of sugary stuff. My body doesn't do well with that. So subjectively is an important thing. Let's not just denigrate the idea of being subjective. You have to know yourself. But objectively, let's think about some objective science. One of the things that I think about is sleep. All right. I never really paid attention too much to sleep. I just knew that I didn't sleep really well. I had a hard time getting to sleep and staying asleep. My life got changed literally when a friend of mine recommended a book called Why We Sleep by a sleep specialist named Matthew Walker. And so when I read this book, Why We Sleep, it literally changed my life, because I started learning the science of sleep, what sleep does to your brain, how it repairs your brain, how it empties toxins out of your brain, and it cleanses you. And that's the only way this happens to your brain and your body is sleep. So sleep is actually more important than eating and exercise. It's number one.
Wow.
So I'll give you some examples. Most sleep problems are a factor in major mental health conditions like depression, anxiety, even suicidality. We have to sleep, and if you don't sleep, it contributes to burnout, it contributes to heart disease. Your immune system, for example, needs sleep to fight off diseases and infections. If you sleep less than 7 hours per night, you double your risk of getting cancer. Now, that sounds like a scary thing.
Wow.
But according to the science that I've been reading, it's true. Sleep helps us regulate our appetites. For those of you who want to lose weight, sleeping helps you regulate appetite, and it makes healthier food choices. A lack of sleep increases the hormone that makes us feel hungry, while lowering levels of the hormone makes us feel full. So sleeping helps there. There's tons of ways. So rather than me, elucidate more of that, I would recommend the book Why We Sleep. I listened to it on Audible, and literally changed my life. So now when I make sure I get enough sleep, at least 7 to 8 hours. And by the way, you really can't catch up on sleep. And if you're a student listening to this, Sleeping before an exam is one of the best things you can do because your mind, your brain organizes the principles that you've learned. Quick story.
Please.
When I was in law school, I was studying for a property exam, and it was the exam that everybody was afraid of because it was 50 questions, multiple choice, which I hated, and you were given 6 hours to do a 50-question exam. So think about that. So, and the professor was very intimidating. So I studied and studied and studied till I knew this stuff backward and forward. And the night before the exam, I studied till 2 to 3 in the morning. I got to the exam at 9. And as I looked at the paper and read the questions, I could not understand. My brain was not working. Not because I didn't understand mentally, but I had a lack of sleep, and I simply could not think.
Yep.
I had the presence of mind to think, I've got 6 hours for this, I'm going to go take a nap. I went to the student lounge, and I slept for about 20 to 30 minutes, and came back, and I did fine.
Okay.
But the point is, you can know everything you need to know, but lack of sleep will impede your ability to function well.
Man.
And by the way, impede your ability to drive.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah. Walker talks about microsleep, which is seconds of microsleep that create accidents that people never even know about. So that's another topic just to look up.
That's fascinating. And honestly, I haven't heard of this book, so I'm gonna go onto Amazon and I'm gonna get it because I've always been personally fascinated by the concept of sleep, as well as like even the idea of sleeping on the right side of the clock, where there's a difference between falling asleep and getting 9 hours of sleep from 1 a.m. to 10 a.m. versus falling asleep at 8 p.m.
Absolutely.
And waking up 9 hours after that, whatever that is.
Walker says that we're designed to have at least 7 to 8 hours of sleep and to take at least a 30-minute nap during the day. To have 2 phases of sleep is the optimal.
Okay.
So for those of you who love to nap, don't feel guilty anymore. This is essential to your health.
Empowering, right there. That's so good. But no, I think that, again, you said simplistic, that these are simplistic things. Sleeping is a simplistic concept, but how much we wreck ourselves by our lack of sleep. Again, and I'm guilty of that. So therefore, I'm going to go get this book. Thank you for bringing this to our attention, especially with the subjectivity and objectivity of preventing burnout. As two believers in Jesus, we look to the scriptures so often as ways to be challenged and to be encouraged. So Psalm 73:26 says, "My flesh and my heart may fail, but God is the strength of my heart and my portion forever." What can we learn from this verse and apply this to this conversation?
Yeah, it's interesting, Tony, that you picked that verse because that really is one of my theme and favorite verses in all of Scripture.
You don't say.
Yeah. And I've meditated a lot on this idea, and I've experienced this first portion, which says, "My flesh and my heart may fail." I have experienced a ton of heartache in my own life, seeking my own way, relying on people that were not reliable and dependable, having broken relationships. So I've experienced firsthand the idea of my flesh and my heart failing.
Yeah.
Not only because we're sinful, and we are, and we have a sort of a bent towards sin that we have to resist. But yeah, I'm weak. I'm a frail, weak, finite, limited human being. But God is the strength of my life, my heart, my portion. So the idea there is that we were created ultimately for Him.
Yeah.
And it's only in Christ that we will find satisfaction.
Yep.
We'll feel loved and be loved the way we're supposed to be. And so when we seek that any other way, we're gonna experience pain and failure. So the promise is that if God is my priority, He's my ultimate commitment in life, and I come to Him and obey Him and His commandments were given me for life. And He holds Himself out as the person with whom I should have the deepest, most intimate relationship with.
Yep.
So that's how I meditate about and think about that, that the only thing that we have is God.
Yeah.
And all that God gives us.
Yep.
And apart from Him we can do nothing. John 15.
Yeah. No, and John 15 is another beautiful passage to speak towards abiding in the vine, and to be able to look towards our dependency on Christ. And we'll speak a little bit more about dependency in a moment. As we continue on in this track of looking at Scripture and looking at the person of Jesus. Jesus was this weird, if I can call Jesus weird, a combination of being fully human and fully God. And in his fully humanness, he felt the weight of tiredness. How do we see Jesus modeling the avoidance of burnout in his ministry as God himself, who carried literally the weight of the world on his shoulders? Like, how do we see Jesus modeling the avoidance of burnout?
Yeah, multiple ways. First of all, I guess we could say theoretically, Jesus as God, and God, the author of the universe, right, never tires. And yet, scriptures tell us that God rested.
Yep.
Right? He rested. He established Sabbath for man. Jesus practiced rhythms in his ministry. He did not go 24/7. There's a few scriptures that just help us understand that. For example, in Mark 1, it says, very early in the morning, while it was still dark, Jesus got up, left the house, and went off to a solitary place where he prayed. Now think about that. Jesus, the Son of God, who created everything, in whom is everything, right? He spent time alone with his Father in prayer. Again, Matthew 14, it says, after he had dismissed the crowds, he went up on the mountain by himself to pray, and when evening came, he was there alone. Interesting. He was there alone, and he dismissed the crowds. What does that mean? When Jesus was alone praying, he had said no to the crowds. And think about it. Those crowds were filled with people with needs. They were all needy. They all were clamoring for his healing, his attention, his teaching. And what did he say? No. He said no because he wanted to say yes to the Father, to be alone with the Father, and cultivate that intimacy with God. Another passage talks about him withdrawing to desolate places to pray. So I think right there is modeled that Jesus spent time alone with the Father in solitude, and he rested. He went to sleep. He actually slept. Again, just highlighting that, the importance of that. So Jesus said no, oftentimes, to doing ministry in order to, he resisted external pressure. And I think one of the lessons that we can learn is we need to resist both external pressures to be busy and keep going and going and going. And we need to resist the internal pressure, which is our own thought life, our own pressure to be productive. We're not called to be productive. We're called to be faithful to him. And we're not called to do everything. We can rely on him to do what he wants to do through us, but we have to be stewards.
Well, that line there is really profound, that we're not called to be productive, we're called to be faithful. And we see just some really incredible examples as we look at Jesus, how he took the chances to step away and pray, how he took the moments to rest. He took the moments to literally, again, embrace his humanness. And if Jesus embraced his humanness, I think we are too as well. And so I think that is just something so crucial, that we look so much to Jesus as the Savior. Of course, we're supposed to, but I think that there's some lessons that we miss in his humanness that we're to take a note from. A note from. Okay, so there is a quote that one of my professors at Lancaster Bible College shared with me in one of our pastoral classes, and it has done a massive number on my own mind and heart, to the point where I actually asked my wife to paint it on a canvas that's hanging up above my desk. I'm reminded of it almost every single day. The quote is this. I'm going to read it twice as well. We do not discipline ourselves to display our diligence to God. We discipline ourselves to demonstrate our dependence on God. Here, one more time. We do not discipline ourselves to display our diligence to God. We discipline ourselves to demonstrate our dependence on God. And I love this quote for so many reasons. First of which, there's lots of the letter D is in here, and the alliteration of it. The pastoral mind of alliteration is always so good.
Right.
But it is challenging on a number of different ways. But how does this particular quote play into the conversation of burnout?
Well, I think embedded in the question is the theology of grace. Our relationship with God is not based on works, or in other words, is not based on what I can display anything to God.
Yeah.
That's not what I'm trying to do, is display something or prove something. My relationship with God is dependent on His love for me, His unconditional love for me. And for me having righteousness based on Christ's work, His sacrifice, so I don't have to prove anything to God. So what I'm reminded of is another quote by A.W. Tozer, who said, "What comes into our minds when we think about God is the most important thing about us."
Yeah, that's good.
And the whole idea there is, how do we think about God and our relationship with God? Because if I'm trying to prove something to God and display something to God, either my talents or my abilities, my faithfulness, or as the quote says, my diligence, that's in a sense a fool's errand. I'm not required to display anything to God other than place my faith in Him. And if I'm trying to prove something to God, that is going to create stress and anxiety, and again, something that's impossible to do.
Yep.
So I can rest in the fact that we're loved. I can rest in the fact that I can have an intimate relationship with God, not because of anything that I do, but because of what He has done and His approach toward me.
Yep.
So I can start to see myself through the grace-filled eyes of Christ, as opposed to my futile attempts.
Yeah.
Right, to prove something to Him.
No, for sure. And I think that another part of this quote is just to acknowledge that we so easily look at God and we think, okay, I need to earn God's love, therefore I will discipline myself. And that's deeply flawed thinking. It's like we don't do anything to earn God's love. We have it by the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ, and confessing our sins and calling Him as Lord and Savior. And so we have His love, and we have, but we strive towards it. Going back to that Rebecca Lyons quote of that, we are striving towards freedom. We don't need to strive towards it. We just need to discipline ourselves to say, hey, I am utterly dependent upon you, God. I can't do this without you. But we try to do it out of a Christian badge of honor of, look how many devotionals I've done, and look how many sermons I've preached, and look how many people I've led to the Lord, to show my diligence to God. But no, it's not about doing for God. It's about being with God, as you addressed earlier, and this dependency piece on God.
And ironically, I find the most peace and the most rest when I realize my dependence on Him as opposed to it depending on me.
That's good.
In ministry, when I get up to teach or do counseling, I'm always saying, God, I can't do this apart from you. And I enter into my weakness just like Paul did in 2 Corinthians 12. I'll gladly boast in my weakness that the power of Christ may be manifest to me or made through me.
Yep.
And so that gives me peace. It's like you said, it's not proving something to Him. It's like, God, okay, I can't. I am wholly dependent on you.
Yep.
I like to pray sometimes, Tony. I'll say, Lord, I can't take a breath without you. My heart won't beat apart from you. I live and move and have my very being in Him.
Yep. That's good. No, that's so good. And so, as we continue on in this dialogue about burnout, let me just ask you this question. If someone says, okay, Dave, I acknowledge that I am deep into burnout. Like, hey, I'm the problem. It's me. I'm in burnout. How do I climb out? Yeah. How would you respond to them if they ask that question?
I guess my first response would be, how serious are you about climbing out? Because the key to climbing out of burnout is really, you hold the keys. And I would say, again, I would advise you, I want you to start to rest. I want you to slow down. I want you to be intentional and radical about it. And you have to, what you really have to do is you have to get underneath. Like, what is the heart, what's going on in your heart that's creating the activity, so much activity that you are burned out.
Yeah.
Where are the pressures coming from? What are you doing? Why are you doing it? And if you don't go after the heart issue, and we just engage in behavior management, it's not gonna last. So what's really happening in you that's creating this pressure always to be productive, to perform, to be active, as opposed to slowing down and being with God and having margin in your life.
Yep.
So a question would be, what happens for you if you just stop for an hour? What would it be like for you to sit and be alone for an hour with God? Now some people would say, oh, that'd be great. But when you go to do it, what anxieties bubble up?
Yep.
And we've had a lot of pastors come in on an emergency basis where they come in and they say, you know what, I can't continue. I don't know what's going on with me. And I've seen pastors literally have physical symptoms. I got a phone call from a pastor of a major church, said, my feet, I can't feel my feet. It's tingling. One pastor who I actually interviewed on a TV show, he actually said, I was in the middle of preaching a sermon, and in the middle of this sermon, the floor dropped out from under me. I looked up, and I walked out of the church. And this is a church probably 800 to 1,000 people. I just walked out into the parking lot, and I started walking around the parking lot. That's all I could do in the middle of a sermon.
Wow.
And he said, I looked behind me, and my church was following me. He had no idea.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. And just to say that again, how much burnout the bottom can fall out at a moment's notice. And you're playing with fire when we are the more and more that we drive ourselves deeper and deeper into the hole as burnout. So just ask the question that our hypothetical person just asked of how do I climb out? I think all of us need to ask that question and being honest of like, what are ways that I can try to climb out of some unhealthiness and toxicity.
And the better question is, how do I not get into it in the first place? How do I prevent it? Which we've talked about.
Facts. So true. Yeah. And what's the preventative measures that I can take that and not even get in there with a 10-foot pole? Right. So no, you are absolutely right. Another hypothetical person here that's speaking. He says, "Hey, so what about a family member? I've been burned by a family member or a friend who is experiencing burnout. So I'm kind of dealing with that secondhand trauma. What was the word?
Secondary
traumatic experience. I am a family member, and I'm getting the waves of someone else who's just experiencing burnout and their own healthiness toxicity. What do I do? What would you say to them?
Well, I mean, first of all, I would really want to explore what do they mean by they're getting affected by this person who's burned out.
Yeah.
And you just said toxicity. What is actually happening? What is this person doing? For example, you could be on staff in a church, and the senior pastor has this compulsion to always be productive and drive. I mean, that's a different question than a family member who is, affecting you.
Yep.
So it'd be helpful to know more about that,
Sure.
that circumstance. But I mean, the bottom line is, what are the underlying issues that is creating the environment in which this burnout is occurring? And do you, as a person who's on the receiving end, have any control? And if you do, can you start to minister to this person? Can you help that person see what's going on in their own heart?
Yeah.
Can you cultivate grace toward them? Because burnout is a real thing, and so if they're doing this unwittingly, they don't know that they're impacting you. It's helpful to hold up a mirror and with very loving, grace-filled, say, "Hey, listen, can I share with you how you're impacting me? And I'm concerned about you. What's happening for you, and how can I serve you?"
Yeah. I think it's really good. And I think another part that comes to mind, whether you're thinking about your own self trying to climb out of the hole of burnout, whether you're trying to help lovingly talk to a family member, a friend, a colleague, etc., is this idea of trying to address some of the root of the issue rather than addressing some of the fruit of the issue. And I think that sometimes we can look at someone's anger and we can just get annoyed and angry ourselves at someone's anger, where it's like, well, why is that anger even there? And now those who, like myself, who are not trained counselors, we shouldn't necessarily assume the role of I'm going to get to the roots of their trauma. At the same time, we have to know that there's always something deeper to the story of why someone's reacting the way they are, or why they're burnt out the way they are.
Yes.
And so there's a level of asking for grace and patience towards an individual as you interact with them, or if someone's interacting with yourself who's feeling burnt out, but also saying, hey, like, be willing to ask if you have the relationship, that's the big piece, is if you have a relationship with someone, to be able to ask deeper level questions, acknowledge that there's something deeper beneath the surface of their anger, or their jealousy, or their lust, or whatever is going on that's causing them to act a certain way. And so I think that's a piece of it that we need to be willing to do with some deeper level probing questions in that way, whether it's in our own self-awareness or towards the people around us that we love.
Yeah. We coach people, mainly pastors, who go on sabbatical. And one of the things that we find is when a pastor goes on sabbatical, let's say a 2 or 3 month extended leave, the idea is, when I get off, it's going to be so great. And what we find is when the person gets off, their anxiety increases significantly.
Huh.
And so usually the pastor's pretty puzzled about that. Like, what is going on here? And part of what's going on is the activity, the busyness, has suppressed anxiety.
Oh, yeah.
And so now that the activity's stopped, the anxiety comes up.
Yep.
And so what does that mean? That means that, like you said, a root and a fruit. Well, one of the roots is we don't know how to, or this person hasn't dealt with the things that are in his soul that are making him anxious. And he's been covering it over and managing behavior as opposed to managing the heart.
Yep.
So I think you alluded to that, and it's really important to help people start to go after heart issues as opposed to just behavior management.
Oh, and it's that weird scientific idea around like adrenaline, and how like our adrenaline gets pumping and pumping and pumping, and then finally we get to stop, and you realize, the anxiety starts bubbling and welling up when we do get to pause. The same idea, like when you're running and you don't realize how much you're sweating until you stop running. It's that same concept. And so I personally, as someone who's dealt with anxiety as part of my story, I know that, like, when I'm up and about and I'm moving, my adrenaline is allowing some of that to go and be released in through myself, that I don't feel as anxious. It's the moments when I'm most calm, the most still, that I feel some of the most anxious moments, which it puzzles me, but it makes sense when I realize some of the concept of adrenaline and how our body physiologically works in that way. Sure. And so, this is like, again, we've covered like such great ground, and yet we just scratched the surface of some of this stuff on burnout. And so, as we begin to land the plane of some of this conversation, would you say, could you give us any other like best practices or practical ideas on how we can prevent burnout?
Practical ideas. Number one, be intentional. Be really intentional about engaging in self-care. Find out what it is that you enjoy doing and gives you rest. So if I'm speaking to ministry leaders, I want to say, look, what outside of ministry are you interested in? Sadly, when I counsel with pastors, a lot of times the answer is, I don't know. Because my whole life is ministry. Everything's ministry. And I've had pastors who say, my wife's in ministry with me, all we talk about is church, now for 20 years. So they've drifted apart. So one idea there is to be very intentional about going after what is it that gives you life that's apart from the church, apart from the, quote, spiritual practices, which might sound ironic that I'm saying that. Intentionally schedule relaxation and fun and vacations. Transcendent activity and beauty. For example, nature, walking, woods, streams, ocean. Be in God's creation. That's a very practical thing to do. I would also say, we were talking about getting to the root as opposed to the fruit. Getting a life coach or getting a counselor. Yep. Counseling is not a dirty word or a dirty term here. Scripture talks us. Jesus is the wonderful counselor. Yep. But we need each other. And sometimes you can't look at your own heart and see what's really going on. So getting a good counselor in your life to help go after these deeper issues that create the anxiety or depression or stress that lead to burnout, those are all good practices. But I guess the bottom line is, I love this saying, don't just try, train. I like that. The idea is when you engage, for example, in a spiritual practice, you have to train yourself so it's automatic, not just trying. So if I say to you, I'm gonna overcome my penchant toward busyness. Okay, I did that for a day. That's not what we're talking about. It's not just trying to do it. It's embedding practices in your life that become routine and habitual. That's an important piece, like for spiritual disciplines, for our spiritual life, as well as engaging in, avoiding burnout.
That's good. That's really good. And so as we, we're going to wrap this up here, and I'm sure that there's some people who are like, but I want you to talk on other things, or there's other questions I have. There's more hypothetical people that still need to ask questions. What would you say if someone wanted to take this conversation further on their own? Books or videos, articles, organizations. You can put in another shameless plug for yours as well over here, but like, what are some resources that come to mind if they want to take this study further?
A couple of things. Now, first of all, on servingleaders.org, our website, we have a lot of resources on burnout. I've done some television interviews with a number of pastors on that. If you look at our resources, I've done a lot of talks on it. We actually do seminars, full-day seminars for staff. And it's interesting, we've been asked to do, not just for churches, but for professional organizations, for pro-life groups and different ministries. So that's one resource. I love Pete Scazzero's work.
Those are good.
Emotionally Healthy Discipleship, Emotionally Healthy Spirituality. His podcasts are wonderful because they address a lot of these concepts. There's a book, For God's Sake, Rest. That's one book. But if you Google burnout, there's tons and tons of resources out there. It's just a matter of, like I said, it's not brain surgery. It's pretty simple to avoid it and to climb out of it. I would say, though, be very, very patient with yourself. I do have pastors who come in and say, look, I'm taking a 2-week vacation. I'm sure I'll be better. No, if you're fried, it's going to take months, and it may be even a year. I've had pastors who come in for 6-month sabbaticals, and they're not ready to go back after 6 months. And I think that's pretty true just generally as well.
Well, to speak to that, another quote that comes to mind is if you walk a mile into the desert, you have to walk a mile out.
I love it.
Like, you just can't just turn one step backwards and you're out of the desert. We would love, how great would that be if that was the case? But there is an intentional, methodical grind that we need to be willing to do to get out of burnouts. It won't happen apart from the Holy Spirit. It won't happen apart from the grace of God over our lives. But our intentionality that we must put forward, the discipline that we've talked about. You walk a mile in, you have to be willing to put a mile or more to get back out.
Maybe 2 miles.
Maybe 2. And so another book that comes to mind for me personally is a book called Crazy Busy by Kevin DeYoung. It is a book that has personally wrecked me.
Is that right?
Kevin DeYoung is a no mincing words kind of author. He's phenomenal in his gospel centrality of speaking towards a little bit of a theology of rest, and it's a phenomenal read, and so definitely one that I'd recommend.
Great.
So, Dave, as we end here, last question. Any final words of wisdom, advice, caution, maybe, that come to mind as we conclude our time here?
I would say, if you can rest in your relationship with God and be secure in Him, then that takes striving out of the picture.
That's good.
And we can rest in Him knowing that it's His work, it's His ministry, and He will accomplish what He wants through us if we know who we are. And we can embrace our limits and see the limits that we have as a gift so that I don't have to do everything. It takes the pressure off. And then really just cultivate, I shouldn't say just, cultivate the disciplines of creating margin in your life. And that's very practical. It means that you don't book 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock. Maybe you book 9 o'clock and 11 o'clock and you have an hour in between. And put in your calendar times alone with God, or times to cultivate relationships, times with people who give you energy and are refreshing. I've got a few friends that I love to be with. I got more than a few friends, but people I love to be with, I schedule that, and don't feel guilty about taking the time because you're stewarding the gifts that God has given you.
That's so good. I think the word that you've used a couple different times of the span of our time is stewarding, and that's exactly what it is. We are stewards of God's grace. We are stewards of this body that we have, that we like to think it's our own. It's not. We're it's on loan, and we're managers of it,
that's right.
and we need to act like it, and we're taking good care of it and stewarding it well. And so, as we end, man, Dave, thank you for your willingness to unpack such a needed conversation.
Well, I appreciate you having me. And if people would like to get a hold of me or our organization, it's servingleaders.org.
Yep.
And my name's Dave Wheatus, and feel free to call or email if we can serve our audience. I would love to do that.
Yeah, no, thank you. Thank you for that and providing that. Again, as I said at the very beginning, such a needed, unfortunately, but such a needed resource. And for organizations like yours that are willing to step into the fray and the pit of what is our disheveled lives many a times. And so just thank you once again. Thanks for processing and getting into the weeds of this and making us better by it.
Thank you.
It's a gift. It really is. So thank you, Dave. If you are enjoying what you're listening to, you're liking what you're hearing, would you be willing to give us a rating, hit the share button wherever you consume the content, and we hope that you will join us next time as we continue to explore the art and science of building influential capacity. Catch you next time.